My name is Oriana Ides, and I'm our region's technical assistance and training specialist. I will be moderating today's session. I'm incredibly excited. Today, we are centering or rooting into what might this mean for youth and young adults, and what might this look like in their spaces, the spaces we are creating for them. Today's session has a lot of content to cover. Here are the questions that we will be exploring today and throughout the series. What might the peer workforce need to know about the difference and similarities between abuse, harassment, and bullying? Why is this the distinction important in our work? What might new phenomena related to bullying, cyberbullying, sexploitation look like, sound like, for which we need to raise awareness, right? And what are the challenges do we foresee at the workforce level? What training resources or other supports could help resolve the challenges that we face? We also really want to uplift and create abundant space for successful strategies in anti-bullying policy and practice. And so we have these questions here outlined as well. So our first panelist is Dr. Lupita Espinosa, professor at California State University. After Lupita shares for 10 minutes, her offering, we will hand it over to Tay and then Aja. So that is the kind of flow, 10 minutes each. Please use the chat to hype up what they're offering, to pose your experience and wisdom, to be in conversation with them that way. Use the question and answer to contribute questions that you'd like to add to the conversation. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Lupita Espinosa.
I will be focusing on cyberbullying experiences among Latinx youth. And I want to start off by saying that I know folks have a preference for whether it be the term Latinx or Latine or Latino, Latina. And so for this talk, I will be using the term Latinx with an understanding that it's not everyone's preferred term. Also, I want to start off by saying that I approach this talk primarily wearing my researcher professor hat. So what you're going to hear from me is what we know based on a lot of studies, peer-reviewed science. But I think it's important to note that aside from that researcher professor hat that I wear, I'm also a Mexican-American daughter of wonderful immigrant parents. I'm a first-generation college student. I'm a mother to 2 young children, right? So I bring kind of all of those perspectives with me. Okay, so in the short 10 minutes that I have with you, these are the topics we'll discuss. I'll start with a brief rationale for why it is important to focus on Latinx youth when considering the topics of peer dynamics and bullying. I'll touch on some key points that research tells us about cyberbullying and discuss 2 newish or newer cyberbullying related phenomena. And I'll wrap up with 3 promising strategies in terms of supporting Latinx youth who are dealing with different incidents of cyberbullying. Latinx youth are one of the largest and fastest growing groups in the US. They make up slightly over 25% of the nation's total population under the age of 18. So when we consider policy and legal decisions, the development of programs and resources, these decisions will certainly have an impact on opportunities for Latinx youth. Moreover, although they make up a sizable portion of the US population and of public school students, we know that they tend to be largely underserved by schools and mental health supports. In addition to these points related to the demographics, compared to teens from other ethnic backgrounds, studies have found Latinx youth to be at higher risk for some mental health problems and in facing some unique challenges in school, such as having greater dropout rates than other youth. We also know that Latinx youth may face additional non-normative stressors, things like acculturative stress or experiences with discrimination. Thus, it's important to examine how their social experiences, how their bullying incidents may further contribute to or help explain some of these stressors that they face. In addition to considering these unique challenges that Latinx youth face, it's also critical to know about and to appreciate the resiliency, the strong cultural values such as feminismo, and the community cultural wealth that many Latinx youth hold. So as we're working with Latinx youth who may be involved in cyberbullying, we want to consider these assets that they also hold and that they bring with them. Now, what does research tell us about cyberbullying? So cyberbullying has been conducted for about maybe about 2 decades now. Yet in that time, multiple definitions and methods for operationalizing cyberbullying have been proposed with no real consensus. So some define cyberbullying as an extension of face-to-face bullying, right? So it's very similar to face-to-face bullying, but now it's just simply occurring through online or electronic platforms. Others define cyberbullying as an entirely different concept with distinct underlying mechanisms. And the reason that this lack of agreed upon definition matters is because it means as researchers, we're all defining it in slightly or vastly different ways as we conduct our studies. And this has implications for the prevalence estimates we have on cyberbullying, and also it can have implications for how interventions and support is being delivered. So some of the concepts to consider broadly with bullying incidents across school and online is we often think about these incidents as being repeated. And we often think about this power imbalance that exists between the person being victimized and the person doing the bullying. There have been some studies that center this issue of how to define cyberbullying back to the adolescents that we're ultimately trying to serve. So for example, this study that was published last year, in the study, youth were asked to describe cyberbullying in their own words. And here are some of the ways that adolescents who participated in the study described cyberbullying. So this is their own words. So you can see, for example, that the first one seems to align with thinking of cyberbullying as just an extension of face-to-face bullying, right? So if someone posts insults, mean comments, your personal stuff, that would be cyberbullying. Whereas this last quote on the slide captures some of these unique aspects of cyberbullying, in which the person who engages in the cyberbullying is able to do so.
No, that's you.
So we know that some of the attributes of cyberbullying that make it unique are the possibility of remaining anonymous, the fact that it tends to be more public and can be witnessed by more people, and that it can take on this kind of more visual focus, right? So if we think about posting photos of others, for example. Something else I'd like to highlight in terms of what research tells us is that children and adolescents seem to be less likely to tell their parents about cyberbullying incidents compared to school bullying incidents. And there's a couple of reasons for that. So among children and younger teens, this is often because they fear that their parents will take away or restrict their phone and computer access if they know that they are being cyberbullied. Whereas among older teens, they tend to report that it's because they don't want to burden their parents with this, cyberbullying they're experiencing. They don't want to worry them. Or they know that maybe their parents aren't that tech savvy, so they're not going to be able to really help them anyways. Finally, research has consistently shown that cyberbullying victimization is related to a host of psychosocial and school adjustment outcomes. This has been found in research across the world, and research such as my own has shown that it can even have the same day impact as well as long-term impact, spanning across several years. In the US, most cyberbullying research has been done with white youth, but increasingly, we're seeing research document how youth from other different ethnic backgrounds, including Latinx youth, are also impacted by cyberbullying. Now, I'll discuss topics related to cyberbullying that are being explored and kind of gaining more attention. So with cyberbullying happening online, these incidents are often witnessed by others, and research is increasingly documenting how this may impact them. So for example, students who witnessed cyberbullying only and did not personally experience it is the group who seemed to, in one study, report the highest levels of depressive symptoms and social anxiety. So students who witnessed cyberbullying, even though they personally were not the target of it. highest levels of depressive symptoms, and social anxiety. In my own research, I have found that Latinx middle school students are impacted in unique ways by seeing their peers get bullied online. Bystanders may feel helpless, they may feel anxious when they witness cyberbullying, and oftentimes they report that they don't know how to intervene, or they become worried that they may become the next target. Another growing area within cyberbullying research among Latinx children and adolescents is ethnic biased or identity-based bullying. This may include being targeted because you have an accent, because of your skin color, because you speak a language that is not English. And unfortunately, I don't have a lot of time to go into a lot of detail here, but identity-based cyberbullying has become this topic deserving of a lot more attention because of the increases we've seen of online hate in the last few years. And research has shown that Latinx youth, especially in new destination cities throughout the US, may be vulnerable to identity-biased bullying. This top study here by Cordoso and colleagues found that what they referred to as ethnic biased bullying was directly related to depressive symptoms. Okay, now in the last minute or two that I have with you, I'd like to leave you with 3 promising strategies that have been identified in the research for supporting Latinx youth who are cyberbullied, but certainly we can think of this expanding to lots of different groups of youth who experience cyberbullying. I won't go into much detail with the first one here because it seems like this might be more fitting for tomorrow's webinar focused on schools, but I have to at least mention that school-wide interventions have been found to be the most effective ways of reducing bullying, both in schools and online. And school-wide interventions are implemented at the school, the classroom, and the individual level. So over 15 years ago, I was a part of a team that implemented one of these school-wide interventions in a set of schools. And some of the things we did working with the schools was we incorporated the topics of bullying into the curriculum. We had parent information sessions. We developed methods for students to safely report bullying, right? So we can think about at the school, class, individual levels, how can we support youth in schools? Another promising strategy is community-based implementation of treatments for mental health problems. In one study with Latinx parents, despite their endorsing stigma about mental health problems and treatment seeking, most parents stated that they wanted to help their children improve their symptoms of worrying, of sadness, and that they wanted to find ways to do this formally and informally. And parents asked for ways to access care in their communities, right? So specifically noting a desire to have more school programs and community health clinics. And the final promising strategy is skill development. So for example, mental health professionals can practice skills with bystanders that they can use to intervene when they witness cyberbullying. Findings suggest that just telling the bully to stop or telling an adult about the bullying incident results in stopping the bullying more than 50% of the time. So thinking about how we can provide skills for steps students can take or different coping strategies such that when they observe or they witness bullying, we can think about how they can manage that, how can they cope with that, what are some steps that they can take so that we can work towards decreasing this depression or anxiety that we often see linked to experiences with cyberbullying.
My name is Ark Telos Saint Amor, which is a very long name, so most folks call me Tay. My mandatory pronouns are they, them, their, and I'm the executive director of Youth Move National, as well as the owner, founder of Ark Telos Consulting, so drop a little fancy thing for my company there. And before we formally get started, and I know I only have 10 minutes, but I want to tell y'all a little bit about myself. And I do this for 2 reasons, one of which is not to be egotistical. So I assure you, there is strategic sharing involved in this. I share it once because I'm not an expert on literally anything besides myself. So I share a little bit about myself so you know that when we go through my 10 minutes, that this is very much so my perspective. I'll be using I statements. And really, this is the lived experience that I have and hold that you're going to see come out through my answers, right? So that's one of the reasons. And two, gosh, do I have a lot of multiply marginalized identities. So that's all to say I have very real lived experience in being bullied for the vast majority of my life. But with that, this is also about fostering inclusivity. And I would say I also have vast experience as well in finding my people and finding it in my community and feeling affirmed and beautiful as myself. So those are the two reasons really why I share this. I'm rambling already. Let's get into it. So I'm neurodivergent, I'm autistic, I have co-occurring serious mental illness, I'm queer, I'm trans, I'm Latine, I'm victim survivor, I'm Mexican indigenous, specifically I'm Coatecan. My tribal nation is in down southern Texas, northern Mexico. I went to business school for some reason. I always question that, but it is a thing that I did. I'm currently in grad school with a dual major, also a thing I'm questioning and a thing that I'm doing. And I have 20 years of business development, DEI, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And I already share where I'm from. So that's a little bit about me. Again, I share those because, gosh, being autistic and neurodivergent and a person of color and queer and trans and a victim survivor, all of those things really added up to both me having a very, very unique lived experience and perspective, but gosh, also being really bullied really throughout my entire life. And I would say bullying would probably be like the gentle term that we could use. And I'm sure that we could probably go up to harassment and definitely abuse as well that I've experienced. But again, I think the power, and we'll talk a little bit about this when we get into the content, of some of our identities and the communities that we come from is that finding your people and leaning into your people and your communities that can really foster that sense of belonging, right? It's about finding your people, creating that community together. So it's this thing that both divides us, but also brings us closer together. And so I really, really love that. We'll throw up just my company logo because I'm so proud of it. I had a friend of mine say that it looks like the Wildberry Pop-Tart logo, which I'm just like all about those colors. We do not endorse Pop-Tarts. So SAMHSA, MHTTC, we're not here for Kellogg, but I just love these colors. So that's a little bit about my company there. And then the next slide is about Youth Move National. So just a little bit about them quickly. The MOVE stands for motivating others through voices of experience. And everything we do is about youth with lived experience. And so if we go to the next slide, I can talk a little bit about our vision statement because it's really going to apply to a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about today. So our vision at Youth Move National is envisioning a future in which young people are valued as empowered leaders, advocates, and designers of communities that are built for all youth to thrive. Now, I place an emphasis on all youth to thrive because we know not all youth are thriving. A matter of fact, disproportionately, those historically and presently excluded, marginalized identities within our countries are being disproportionately bullied, right? We see, and some of that research that we just heard about, right? Disproportionate rates of suicidal ideation, of death by suicide, of substance misuse, of houselessness, of really just coming from unsupportive environments, right? And so this kind of leads in to the first question that I was, or the first question I was asked to answer, which is what might be a new phenomenon related to bullying for which we need to raise awareness. Now, I will say I cheated a bit because unfortunately, this is not new, right? We are under settler colonialism. I'm Mexican indigenous, so I'm very used to feeling that oppression, right? That racism that we experience, right? That sexism that we experience, cis-sexism, all of the isms that we experience. But really what I'm noticing, which isn't new, but is necessary, but is increasing, is attacks against our queer and trans youth legislatively. So I pulled up this chart from ACLU. I checked it again today. It is still at 501 bills across the nation that are really trying to legalize eugenics, I mean, we are talking about biological racism here from a legislative point of view. And this is really, really terrifying. And it's something that I hoped I wouldn't see increase in my lifetime. I was actually hoping to see that decrease, but we are seeing that increased. And we've got a news headline here that also says, if you can perceive your screen, number of trans homicides doubled over 4 years with gun killings fueling increased. And so we just are seeing this phenomenon across the nation of increased bullying from literally a legislative level. And a lot of these bills are actually passing. We're seeing that in Florida and Texas, and judges are letting those go through. These are being enforced. So it's really, really scary out there. So as we focus on what is happening and how to interrupt it, call in your senators, call in your state officials. That's another thing that you can do, because unfortunately the bullying is happening at the highest level. So what challenges do we foresee at the workforce level, right? Here to talk about the mental health workforce and what training resources and other support would help resolve these issues. Well, I do a lot with youth peer support. I love youth peer support. I'm a huge component of youth peer support, and I really see that as an amazing way to interrupt bullying and really to foster those sort of affirming behaviors and environment. But when I look at the field today, I see a lot of inconsistent funding, right? It's very hard for youth peer support programs to get started up and to sustain, right? It's really hard to find the funding for that. And if you do have that, gosh, we're talking about non-living wages, right? And so really universally in the peer support realm, we are seeing folks being underpaid. And that is a real issue, especially when we continuously see the cost of everything going up, especially housing. Not actual peers working in peer support spaces. Now, this is controversial. I know that. But y'all, peer means peer, right? So if you are an 18-year-old who is struggling with substance misuse issues, a peer would be someone who's very close to 18 who is also struggling with substance misuse issues, right? A peer would not be a 41-year-old individual whose uncle has struggled with substance misuse, right? So really making sure that when we say peer, we mean peer. Toxic positivity and burden shiftings by systems and employers. I saw resilience come up already today. That's a word that I could spend 7,000 hours talking on, where it really is glorifying sometimes the trauma that folks face. It's like this burden shifting of the system itself, right? System keeps doing harm, keep doing the thing, but we say, oh gosh, look at you. You're so resilient. Oh gosh, I'm so proud of you. Look at you doing the thing. Like, oh, you're surviving. Yay. We got to focus on the system, because that system's going to keep doing that harm. So if we burden shift onto that person and exemplify them as being resilient, we sometimes lose track of the thing that's actually doing the harm. And there's a difference between surviving and thriving. And virtual signaling and performative allyship, right? I see a lot of times that folks will talk a good game, which is great, but you have to follow it up with action. Literally, being an ally is actionable things. It's a verb. It's things you have to do. So how might we increase opportunities for young people to communicate their experiences and needs in relation to safety, abuse, harassment, and bullying? This is an easy one. This is a fast one. Stop talking and listen. It's really as simple as that. And I know actually in practice, it's really hard for folks to do that, but really let people have self-agency to tell you what they need. Maybe shush a little bit and listen, right? Okay, next slide. How might we build a culture that creates and interrupts and repairs harm? I love that, repairs. Again, to me, this is action. Do it, right? Don't wait for someone else to do it. Don't, and I love that I'm here, but don't just come to a webinar and think, oh, check the box, I did it. You did not. Knowledge is one thing, but action is different. So you have to step in and do something about it. But cancel culture, y'all, is not a thing. It is truly, truly not a thing. We actually see that being a buzz term used by sort of some really toxic folks on the alt-right side of things, when really those folks are laughing their way all the way to the bank, right? Like we have some examples on your screen of folks who have used the N-word, have done songs about lynching, openly hate trans people, and would go to jail for their beliefs around that. And these folks are literally making millions of dollars. They're topping the charts. So when we talk about cancel culture, I think we really need to look at the victim survivors, because when we look there, we actually see they're the ones still being canceled, right? So I got this study shows 75% of workplace harassment victims experienced retaliation when they spoke up, and a disproportionate amount saw termination as well. What are current tensions in the field that you are grappling with? Oh, family first. I hear that all the time in my field. It is not family first, y'all. It is supportive, affirming environments first. If it was family first for me, I would be back into the abusive situation that I was in while I was growing up, right? So it is not always family first. We have to make sure we're looking to those supportive environments. Harm reduction means harm reduction. It does not mean abstinence only. It does not mean XYZ. It means tearing it down, right? So folks, like harm reduction, please, let's do this right. And abolition and liberation work is not a dirty word, y'all. It's important words. It's creative. It's innovation. It's fun. It's beautiful. It's amazing. We have to start talking about dismantling the system while we're still doing system harm reduction and system reform. Thank you all so much. Appreciate you.
Adrienne Yellowhair Dashijine. I'm going to introduce myself in Navajo because that's the way we do it. Yat A, Dana Nishle, Hanagahni Nishle, Tabaha Bashishchin, Nakaisi Jini Dashiche, Dotsuna Jine Dashinale, Okut Ego Dana Nishle. So I'm currently going to school at the University of Portland. I study political science and global affairs, as well as a minor in education. So those are just my clans and the way that I recognize myself as a Navajo person. So all right, so I wanted to include this one in here to just allow for you guys to take some time to stop, reflect, and truly remember. Ask yourself these questions while you're reflecting. What do you know about the land that you currently reside on? I know when we started this session, I saw that some people were doing like the acknowledgements of who was historically there and the original land takers. So what do you know currently about the land that you currently sit on? And what do you know about the history of its caretakers who were historically taking care of that land? And how have you been taught to think about Native Americans in what is now called the United States? So this is really calling in some of those biases and stereotypes and stigmas that we often subconsciously hold within our minds because of the messages that were sent from the media, right? So I want you to just allow that time to think about that, reflect on those questions, and feel free to put them in the chat or feel free to write them down next to the notebook you have open. I have my notes open, so I'm going to take some time to think about that also. So where to start? Where to start with engaging authentically with Indigenous communities and where to start your partnership with Indigenous communities is really important because in order to start that, you need to first acknowledge and or understand the complexities of historical and generational trauma at work. I could spend hours talking about generational and historical trauma and the ways that it has persisted inside of communities that I've been a part of and inside of my life, and how as a foster youth and like being adopted by my grandmother and my aunt, how that has also impacted their lives, the ways that I was brought up. But I just want to make sure that we are acknowledging those complexities and taking time to hold space for them and how they manifest inside of school systems or systems of care or mental health places, and how it really impacts youth in those spaces. So next, when you're working with local communities to support their youth, it's really integral, especially with Indigenous communities, to incorporate some kind of cultural practices, activities, or prevention programs. A lot of these things already exist. You don't have to reinvent the wheel here. You just need to do a lot of research into what is happening in that area, and then allow access for youth to have ability to practice those things that are really rooted in their identity. Because we know that through settler colonialism and through like the very subversive, oppressive things put in place and the erasure that happened with Indigenous communities a really long time ago, but it's still happening currently. So let's also hold space for that. There has been a lot of erasure in language and culture, and tribes now are fighting to keep it alive. And so putting youth in contact and in resource with what is available for them to root themselves in their identity is really life-saving and life-changing. This next one is also really important. It touches on land back and reparations. So the land back movement can be understood as the transfer in power back to Native leaders, back to Native elders, and back to young community members. So land back is really talking about giving back the ownership of land and how to take care of it back to Indigenous communities who have the necessary knowledge and the necessary resources to really care for the land in a way that's sustainable. And okay, so this is kind of like everything I already said, but put into 3 steps that are a little bit more digestible, although I feel like the first slide was still really digestible. So this first step here is talking about understanding the unique history of the land and the history of its original land stewards and the current realities of tribal nations in your area. So this one is really research-based. It's talking about sitting down, going, doing a quick few searches, and then also taking it a step further to go into your community and learn what resources are available, who is in your area, what kind of Native communities and what kind of Native movements or what is the Native like presence in the area that you're at, and how can you be a meaningful and beneficial part of the community without being extractive or transactional. This next step is about building those relationships with Native families, youth, and communities, and it's building them in a good way. And it's talking about really sitting down and understanding that these communities oftentimes already have their own systems of care put into their philosophy as an Indigenous community. So really taking that time to realize that you're not coming in as a savior to help these people. You're coming in as an outsider to support what's already being put into the community. Number 3, ensuring that Indigenous youth have access to medicines and cultural tools that can be their elders, that can be the practices, that can be the ceremonies. And you can do this by working with community leaders and community leaders who are in partnership with other programs in your local, regional, state area. Okay, so this one is really, really important. Like I mentioned before, culture as a prevention tool in bullying and fostering belonging is really important for Indigenous youth. I myself found weaving, on the other side you saw weaving. I myself found weaving to be really helpful. It literally helped save my life and helped me get through my senior year when I was going through a really hard transition. And it was really helpful. And so understanding that culture is a really important and really strong tool that grounds Indigenous youth into their identity and reminds them of the strength and assets that they have as an Indigenous person. So it fosters belonging, and it starts with understanding the values and traditions important to young adults and how they can interact with institutions. So institutions can help do this by reiterating local community programs and projects that are already happening, that already exist. And it's just putting them in contact with those resources. Second is dismantling the settler colonial structure. Dismantling it, that's a whole other conversation. But a part of dismantling and what you can do is also providing non-Western forms of medicine or care. And so this can be in form of ceremony, this can be in form of like smoking and smudging. These are things that you'll need to have community leaders who have the necessary knowledge to do, but this is something that you can also research and provide for the Indigenous youth that you might or may have already come in contact with. Another one is returning back to Indigenous ways of knowing. This is just to reiterate again that Indigenous people already have knowledge and culture there as preventative resources for bullying and for fostering belonging and identity building. Lastly, the challenging the erasure of stereotyping of contemporary natives. I asked in my reflection slide that you really confront the stigmas and the stereotypes that you hold of Native people because of the media that we're introduced with. It's Halloween time. I know that I myself am probably going to start seeing, like people wear costumes that are racist and that, being like, oh, I'm going to dress up as Pocahontas type things. And so really understanding and holding space for what your own biases may include is really important and is honestly the foundational step before doing your research and before building relationships with Indigenous communities. It's doing your own research and educating yourself and not putting that burden onto Indigenous people or even Indigenous youth. So here are some existing youth organizations, programs, and efforts to support. Number one is Unity. I myself have been involved with Unity since I was a freshman in high school, and it really is about youth helping their communities. And so it puts the leadership and the agency back into the youth to start, projects and community-led group projects that stimulate the belonging of community and help to outreach in their local community. And so it's a really great tribal youth organization. And the next one is ABLE, American Indigenous Business Leaders. I just got accepted to be into their mentorship program, and they focus on connecting Native youth with resources to a mentor who can then get you into the career spaces that you want to be as an Indigenous person, and they come from a very holistic perspective. Number three, Center for Native American Youth. They do a lot of research-based projects. They do a lot of work in the Washington, D.C. area and a lot with activism and supporting Indigenous people to do the activism. So it's really putting the agency again back into Native youth. Number four is We Are Native. We Are Native is really about implementing the mental health aspect back into the youth. And it talks a lot about like sex health education and helping, it really touch bases on the interrupting bullying and fostering belonging. And they have a lot of resources for Native youth to feel connected to their larger Native community. And also these are only like a really small pool of what is out there. So you can look for your own local tribal community centers in your state and county and regional and area that use it to understand and be aware of what kind of organizations and programs are out there. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Lupita, Asia, Tay. There's some really great questions that were posed to you all. So I want to uplift those and give you all some time and room to answer them. The first one is how best to support Latinx youth who are being racially put down. Acknowledging that it's 2023 and we're still hearing really oppressive language directed at BIPOC children and young folks.
Okay, that's a great question. So I think the last slide about like the 3 promising strategies, we could think about those things, but there's this is one area in cyberbullying research where we're trying to identify like what are the protective factors, right? Or what are the actionable things we can do to support youth. And so there's specifically with, racial slurs, we can think, research has found things like ethnic socialization, cultural practices, which Asia spoke to brilliantly. So thinking about what are the cultural practices, the activities that they may be able to engage in to increase their ethnic pride, right? So there's some research to suggest that if you feel greater ethnic pride, that those racial slurs may not have as deep of an impact, right? Because you have that pride to kind of protect you. There is research to suggest that trying to increase sense of school belonging or just a sense of belonging, right? Is there a group of peers that they can talk to. Are parents open to these discussions, right? And so thinking about, making sure that the teen or the child has someone, right, as an outlet. In terms of friendships, there's research to suggest that just having one close friend protects youth, right? It's not about having a lot of friends. It's not about being popular. It's, do you have one person, right, that you can chat with and check in with and get support from? And also just thinking about, sometimes, we take on the burden and we find what are the local, not the burden, but we facilitate the support for them, right? So can we do some of the work to find local programs and supports? There's hotline numbers, there's in so many communities, we find really great resource centers offering resources, materials that children and teens may not be aware of, right? So thinking of how we can best connect them with those. But it's hard, it's just really hard to know how to best support youth. And oftentimes it is on an individual basis, right? Depending on how it's impacting them, if it's a one-time or repeated occurrence, all of these factors.
I would also just jump in and say all of that is super brilliant, but interrupting that pattern, right? Actually focus on the folks who are doing harm is really, really important. Like, we've got to make sure that we're affirming the folks who are harmed and taking care of, if you will, like the symptom, but the real problem is that behavior. So if you're hearing it, interrupt it. Have a zero tolerance policy. Interrupt that behavior. I like always asking why. Like, why would you use that word, right? And then just keep asking that person why in a group setting. It's kind of like public shaming, but if you do it in like a gentle way, you'll really call them in and kind of force them to sort of reconcile with their own beliefs of why they're using that language. So that may be helpful to get them to the point where they're going to stop using that language. And I think it's really, really important to interrupt that. And again, I know we're not talking about schools, that's tomorrow. But my entire family's queer and trans. We hear the F word a lot walking around in our community. And so often what I hear from my kids when they come home is that the teachers hear it, but it's so hard and difficult to stop class and do something about it that they ignore it. And so they're like sort of actively trying to pretend like they didn't hear the thing. If you hear it, you heard it, step in and do something about it. Take that action to stop that problem at the root.
Within organizations also, professional development really needs to focus on building the courage within its staff to confront language. I as a teacher, have absolutely myself ignored in my 20 years at different points, behavior and language that I didn't know how to intervene upon. And I think just at the very least, acknowledging that you heard it, as you're within your organization, building your personal and larger structure capacity to confront it, starting with at least I heard that and it's not okay.
Tay brought up such a good point about, teachers, there's just not enough training on this, right? There's not enough information about this. In the department that I teach in, most of our students want to become teachers. And, it's a small part of what we have to cover. I'm married to someone who is a high school teacher. It was not a single part of their credential program, covering bullying and the role that teachers can take. And so it's definitely an area where we need to be doing more, acknowledging that teachers have so many things that they have to do and be aware of in the classroom. But this absolutely has to be something where they have a toolkit with different ways that they can, support the students in their class.
What are some of the strategies that can be used with foster youth that do not have an emotional connection to their guardian, but maybe do not have the guardian or family members as a source of support?
As a foster youth myself, I feel like really honing in on the idea of like making sure that they have multiple forms of support. And I really appreciate Tay, who brought up that not putting family first, because like Tay mentioned, family first itself can sometimes be really abusive. And for me, that was also my case. My home was a place where that's where my abuse occurred. And so really focusing on the kinds of support that happen outside of the home and creating environments of support outside of that. Counselors, that can be clubs, that can be sports, that can be, you know, other types of things, and making sure that you're offering outlets to mitigate those kinds of harassment and bullying forms that take place often, and really making sure that you're being transparent about the kinds of resources that are out there for people, especially foster youth, and making sure that you're also communicating with like a case manager if they have one, or like reaching out to their, I can only think of like a case manager who would also take that role of like making sure that they're mentally being supported in that kind of way and emotionally supported.
For what are some of the strategies that can be used with foster youth that do not have an emotional connection with their guardian? I have an interesting analogy for this. I had a colleague who I worked with who really wanted to be friends. And I had this very distinction that, like, we don't need to be friends. We need to be respectful. We need to be affirming. We need to be colleagues. We need to be professional. So I would just add that, like, you actually don't need to have an emotional connection. What you need to do is to provide for that person, is to support that person, is to feed them and house them and clothe them and make them feel seen and loved and validated and affirmed. And if you do all of that, eventually that connection will come. But don't worry about that part. Like, you're the one, you got to take care of them first. That's the first and foremost. Like, that rest will come as long as you're doing that, right? I don't know if you all know Adrienne Marie Brown. Love her so much. She has this quote that is moving at the speed of trust. Just lay that foundation and keep doing it. Trust is fractured with a lot of foster youth. I know it was for me. And so those things don't come easy, but if you keep laying that foundation of love and support, over time, you'll get there. And that's really your job.
How might you differentiate cyberbullying and the general negative effects of social media?
I think I just think of cyberbullying as one of the many negative effects we can see from social media, right? So I don't know if folks saw the number of lawsuits that went in today against Meta, right? Because of the addictive features that they have targeting young users. There's just a long list of the ways in which youth are negatively impacted by social media, right? Even just scrolling, you know, there's been studies that have been done where you assess somebody's self-esteem, for example, before they log into social media and right after, and you see for a lot of youth a significant dip that occurs in their self-esteem, right? The social comparison. Everyone's posting the highlights, and as a teenager, you see that and you think, well, I'm not on the beach, you know, with my friends, and I'm not doing this. And it's that immediate lowered sense of self-esteem after 10 minutes of scrolling online. So there's again, a number of negative outcomes. So you know, trying to increase teens' awareness of that, right? Talking to them about, you know, sometimes we think, oh, teenagers know, right? They spend so much time on these technologies, they must know. But, you know, do they know that most of these things are filtered? You know, do they know, you know, all of these different features of people highlighting the best parts of themselves? Maybe not, right? And reminding teens of that. And sometimes especially with young children, you know, it can be effective for parents, for example, to maybe have restrictions or have open communication, right, about what they're seeing online, can be supportive to help guide them as they're learning what it means to be active on social media.
How do clinicians that are part of the queer community safely advocate for rights while staying safe and not losing their job in places that silence these communities?
Yeah, I love this question. And I see this come up a lot in the work that I do in queer and trans spaces, and I see a lot of folks take pretty extreme answers. And we're usually, what I hear is like, quit your job, right? Like if that's what they're doing, they're not worth it, quit, money talks. As you stated in your question, it's not that easy. Y'all, we all live under capitalism, and it's a horrible thing, but it's our day-to-day reality. We have housing we have to pay for. We've got to put food on the table. It is what it is. So I would never recommend anyone lose their job or do anything that would involve that. But I do think that you have to start looking inward. Is this the right place for you? Can you show up and be your full self? I would also say there's a lot you can do off the clock, right? Like you can definitely advocate on a systematic legislative level outside of work. You can still call your senators, you can write letters, you can write emails, and do those things every day because persistence matters in that situation. So I think that there's a whole lot that you can do while not on that clock. But if we're talking while on the clock, think about it. Is that the right place? Are your folks getting that most support? And also lean into your folks, right? If that's like not a safe work environment for you, it's probably not a safe environment for them to walk into either, right? So really leaning into them so they know you are a safe person, you are an affirmative person, can really help do those workarounds, maybe while you shop for a different job.
How do we connect with Indigenous communities that have stated they do not want to discuss with those outside of the community?
Well, if a community has already, said that they wish to not have a partnership at all, then I think the obvious answer is to respect it. I mean, it's like the whole idea of if someone tells you no, you respect the no because no means no, right? So I would just say, I mean, if you're trying to connect with like an Indigenous community and then they say we wish not to, that is their right. Like that is like when you pose a question, you always they always have the opportunity to say no, which is why you pose the question to get the answer, right? And if your answer is no, then your answer is no, and you got to just, move forward, move along. And it sucks,
Thank you.
but there's probably a really good reason behind why they said no. And I think it comes to play back in with those like ideas of trust. Indigenous communities have fractured trust. We, for like a really long time, were like genocidal practices. Our languages were stripped from us. Our culture was appropriated and stripped from us. Like there are a lot of historical and generational traumas that go into why Indigenous communities choose to not work with certain organizations or governmental systems. It's because our trust has been fractured and we'd rather hone in on ourselves and, protect our sovereignty in that way. And so respecting that and holding space for that is really important.
So I will just jump in and say money talks as well. So if they don't want to talk to you, cool, respect it, try donating, right? If you want to do some good, try giving them money. And so that's one. And then two, y'all, the internet is a magical place. There is a lot of people out there on social media, on blogs, on vlogs. There's a lot of organizations, tribal too, like Capacity Building Center for Tribes.
Yeah.
Huge. They have free videos.
Mhm.
So there is a lot of resources out there for folks who are opting in to talk, because I think another thing you have to be careful of is, oh, you're marginalized? Do the work for me to tell me how I can be better, right? Like you're putting that burden of your education on us. And like, that's too much. We don't really want the burden. So there's plenty of folks out there that are doing that work already. Go find that. The internet is a magical.
Thank you. That question makes me think of scenarios where there might be a school-based therapist that is assigned to work with a young person, and maybe they don't feel comfortable sharing outside of their community things that are impacting them. And so in that case, I would say your work is really to find the organizations, the resources, the people within the community that can be of support, and that it doesn't have to be you. right? What can you do to support and foster a relationship or remove barrier? Because the strengths, the resources are absolutely within the community. That is all we have for questions. I'm so grateful to have had our three incredible panelists here for this question and answer. There are so many ways, opportunities to stay connected with MHTTC Region 9. There are other distance learning opportunities, so please stay connected